All right, it's 11, so we will get started. Keith is, it's 11 o'clock. I mean, I'm not sure whether we are 11. Keith is unable to join us this morning. He's a medical emergency. We wish him well. Emergency identified. Okay, so this is session 3, and what I propose to do is we'll just have an initial quick little chat about how we're going and if this feels okay. But the general rhythm from now on is that we'll be reviewing the book or the books that we've actually read in the past fortnight and previewing the book or books that we're going to read in the next fortnight. So I'm going to suggest that we just kind of go through each book and pick out anything that, you know, if there's something that you've kind of queried or you put a little mark saying, can we talk about that? Or just something that's amused you or touched you or impressed you. I've got plenty of all of those things. So before we go any further, and just a reminder that I am recording this on Zoom. So for those people who are not able to get it and can bear the second-rate experience of watching it on Zoom, that will be available, and I'll send that out on email. So how are we going? What do we think? So
I'm going to tell everyone there's a Matt Damon movie about Odyssey, and they have like the like trailers and stuff, and then they have maps and saying what their old places were and what they are now. So it was really interesting, although there are bits of movies.
of course,
But it was just great, and it's a bit hoppy.
Yeah.
It's called Odysseus. The Odyssey, yes.
it is directed by Christopher Nolan and has not yet been shot. So it will be in cinemas next July. So Christopher Nolan, you may have heard of, probably the most bankable film director in the world. So that he's found this as his next project is really interesting. We can consider whether we think Matt Damon is good casting. He's probably very good casting from a box office point of view. I'm not sure whether he really has the qualities that we'll see. Of course, we've really yet to meet Odysseus, and that's part of the intrigue of the narrative. But when we do, by the way, there is also another film which is out much sooner, next month, called The Return, which I saw last year because it was part of the British Film Festival. When the dates are available, I'll bring them to your attention. And if we want to do a bit of an excursion, we'll try and agree on. Not everyone is going to be able to get to whatever date we make, but I propose that we make it during the day, during the week, and maybe even ideally on cheap ass Tuesdays if they're doing such a thing. So we'll see how we go with that. So that has what's his name? Ralph Fiennes and Isabel Binoche or Elizabeth Binoche. Julia Binoche. They previously made a film together, so that's a lot more believable. Yes. Yes. yeah. He's older and grizzled, and although he's in very, very fine form, and utterly naked at one point, available for inspection. Okay, so those are upcoming movie treats, and yes, I mean the material that comes out around that about we'll revisit arguments about is Ithaca really Ithaca? What route did Odysseus take? What do we think? Where did Homer come from? All that sort of stuff. I'll touch on that in some future sessions because it's a subject all of its own. Oh yeah. Oh good. That is good. Excellent. Thank you for pointing that out. I'll just see if we can. Hello, welcome. I might just check to see that we can. She's successfully got in. Hello, Rhonda. Hi, you're on mute, but that's fine. That's
okay. Sorry. Yep.
That's quite all right. Everyone says hi, and I'll try to remember. My microphone is a little bit hit and miss, so hopefully you'll be able to hear me
Yep.
Can you hear me okay at the moment?
Yes.
Excellent. Good.
Good.
All right. So just in general terms, what's your initial response to having read the first three books now?
This has been a long time eating I know when they were in visiting this school, they have the, you know, the libation and the feast when they arrive. But then I think we don't another quick one for the way to bed. But we got up the next morning and then said, "That's not one." Whatever it's on. It's really dry all the time. It's so short.
It is one of the striking things about the Odyssey, and one of the things which is very unusual in epic poetry of kind of Greek times. And Henry Fielding called it that damned eating poem. I think it was Henry Fielding, and we'll see that there's a fair amount of crying as well. It's kind of understandable that Telemachus cries because he's just a young bloke just getting started, but Odysseus weeps profusely at times. I mean, it's one of the reasons why I love the book so much. It's because it's really so human.
With the culture at the time, because now men are not supposed to cry. You know, occasionally you might see a tear and they're bottling up, and it's not good, you know. Perhaps in those days it was acceptable, wasn't it?
It's a great question, and I actually don't know whether it was generally kind of culturally acceptable. It's equally possible that the poet kind of introduces this because it really would knock you back in your seat if you're a big burly bloke and you're listening to this story about a great hero and he's covering up his face with his cloak because he's in floods of tears. That's kind of one of the things that maybe as this oral poem developed, the poet realized that it kind of gets a real reaction from people. And it may also be because one of the things that we're going to be exploring is, if you like, the relationship between the poet and men and women, and between men and women in the poem. Because one of the things I really, really love about the Odyssey is the role of women within the book. Because in the reality of the time, going back to what was actually the reality at the time, is women were terribly constrained. This is, of course, before any democracy, but even the Queen did not leave the palace very much at all and had very little autonomy or agency. So the poet has an interesting challenge. Clearly, he wants to make, in particular, Penelope and Helen really lively, interesting, complex people. And that's very difficult when they have no autonomy or very little autonomy or agency. And we'll see the ways in which he begins to do that, and shows that Helen and Penelope are every bit the equal of their men. What else?
Back to the gentleman eating. How much is drugs involved?
Well, we're about to find some drugs in book 4.
Yeah, no,
if you've read ahead.
It's also the way that they talk about drinking when God's here. You know, it's always like when they, had a few gobblets, shall we say. So that's why I'm thinking, were there hallucinatory drug use more common, or it just doesn't seem like they just drink and stuff, because all history says they used to drink to excess. So I can't really see, to me they're all off their heads because it's early stages. I'm trying to get there and stay not reading. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Too far ahead. But a lot of it doesn't make sense. It's like when gods appear, they're off their heads, or eating, like you said, drinking. It's no real hard toils or thinking processes or something like this. The gods direct them. If they don't, then the gods come down and say, get on the boat, get on this. It's sort of like I know they're setting the scene, but you've got to admit it's not nicely connected at the moment. And if you said that they use more drugs, I could probably understand a bit more because why did gods only appear to the kings and these people, not the everyday people? And, you know, why do they always, as I said, do it at feasts or before the feasts or during the feasts? You know, it's always with the wine. Yeah, that's it. And it just doesn't, I'm trying because their culture, like you said, the Zen or whatever, you know, when this sort of things develop and trying to set the scene. But there's so many loose holes in it.
Yeah. And that really comes down to, I think, one's own individual comfort with ambiguity, if I can put it like that. I'm trying to get my microphone keeps going on and off. I'm going to leave it off because it's probably worse that it's still on, but it's just not that one.
Wine involves vineyards. Vineyards is agriculture. And I don't know where I'm going too far ahead with the book, but it seems like in Ithaca that they have goats and there's nowhere mentioned so far of growing food. So where would the wine come from?
Well, that is a very good point, because the kind of feasting that happens in the book, which is one of the reasons why we have to be, I think, a little bit reticent about reading too much into what's going on, was nothing like it is depicted here. They're always eating, beef and lamb and pigs and goats. That wasn't the Greek diet in the 7th or 8th century at all. It was very much grain based.
Someone would talk about cutting back to the farms, but they did have farms. So.
Yes, and we'll meet a pig farmer much later or a pig tender much later, pig shepherd, pigard.
Well, I find this one is a lot of people in here because they seem to be sacrificing.
Yeah.
Oh, but that's just an excuse to eat. I presume the wine would be like our wine, because, you know, in the sort of, say in Britain or in the continent, you know, in the 1600s, 1700s, they drank a lot of beer because they couldn't drink water. But the beer was very watery. And in that, the alcohol content was low.
Well, then we know that, and we will see this coming up shortly, there's a reference to the wine being unmixed. So it was stored and carried in concentrated form. And then when you want to drink it, you mix it to 20 parts water. So, and I don't know, because in Shakespeare's time, everyone did drink beer because it was safer than drinking water straight from the Thames. Yeah, and that's, yeah, exactly. That's where we get the term small beer from, because that refers to the weakened beer that you would drink. Presumably it's got some antibacterial qualities to the alcohol.
It was 1 to 20.
Yeah, and then we'll see. So this comes up again later, that how you mix the wine makes a difference to its potency, and it might be that you actually want the wine to be very potent for a particular reason. He said, not wanting to offer a spoiler.
Oh.
Yes.
I suppose that's because the wine.
Yeah, like you go to a party, like a big bowl of punch or something. Good.
The agriculture. There was at one point some, I can't say pronunciation, not good with names, good with numbers. The sun refers to the mainland as having the agriculture. So, and that would be very typical, like New Turkey and stuff like that, where the lambs come from. They're huge lamb producers. I'm not so sure about the cattle, but they could sustain cattle. But goats, because those islands all around there, are, like you said, they're just rocks. So everything would be imported, but the countryside around it and up towards those parts is very rich. So they would just ship it across, you know, like in a little boat.
Yeah, but it wouldn't be your kind of everyday food, you know, that these people are eating like kings, and that's part of the point that the suitors.
It's a court.
Yeah.
So isn't that the point? A bit like Henry VIII only ate
Yeah.
meats, so had a dreadful diet and
Yeah.
suffered for it. So
And even within
The idealist.
absolutely, but even within the world of the poem, it is that we're remembering an age of heroes. This is not you and me now. This is when men were giants and really extraordinarily powerful. So we're remembering a time from hundreds of years ago, you know, in the time after, when there were not just immortals, but there were humans, but they were heroes, and they were almost kind of demigods. Okay, so as I say, we're going to review books 2 and 3 each time. I won't always do this, but when it occurs to me that there are some interesting kind of things to talk about, as we did last time with Xenia, because the whole feasting thing feeds into that. And you may have begun to notice now that the suitors are just eating and drinking. They're not making sacrifice at all. They're not doing things in the right way. So they are just doing it to gorge themselves. And that's going to be part of, you know, one of the reasons why they deserve everything that's coming to them. Okay, so we're going to review book 2 and then look ahead to books 3 and 4. But before that, a couple of housekeeping things. I've got some new dates. Please remind me at the end. I won't hand them out now because I will lose your attention while you're looking at them. I hadn't realized that the typical thing for U3A, because this is my first year here, is to pause for the holidays, the school holidays. So I didn't have that. So it caused issues with people who were attending other courses where it started conflicting later in the year. So I have already sent these out to you by email. I've printed it out. I'd like you to look at it just to make sure that I haven't made a major boo-boo with the dates and that it's going to be okay. All right.
Can I just button, you've got review book 2. I thought we read books 2 and
You're right.
3.
Sorry, it should say reviews book 2 and 3 and then preview 4. You're absolutely right. To be honest, there's not that much difference in what reviewing looks like and previewing in the sense that I'll be talking to points of interest, and someone said you're resisting the temptation to read further ahead. Don't feel that you can't, because you know you can always come back and reread. And as one of the things I want to try and share with you today is the ways in which rereading adds depth to what you're experiencing. You know, it's the nature of any classic. I saw the David Tennant Macbeth, which was from the Donmar Warehouse, part of the National Theatre. So it was kind of recorded and screened here on at the cinema, and it's an extraordinary production. And I was talking to a theatre director last night who said he heard lines in Macbeth that he'd never heard before. Well, of course he hasn't. He has heard them before, but they suddenly resonated because of the way that the production was done.
I wondered, the rhythm of the language, when you reread, somehow you get into the rhythm of the language and it makes it much easier to read. I did wonder, I'm reading the Robert Fables one translation, but I wondered in the original oral tradition, were they, or they wouldn't all be in the same, or were they in the same sort of rhythm? Well, not the same rhythm as the translation, but when they're translated, do they have to accommodate the various versions that they're finding?
A great question, because the Odyssey has been translated now hundreds of times, and even just since the year 2000, there have been probably a dozen new translations that have come out, and every new translator faces the same challenges. There's a very strong metrical rhythm to the original, which doesn't sound natural to our ears because we speak a different language. So the question then becomes, do you try and copy that? Do you create a new sort of rhythm?
You have touched on this before.
Yeah, I've got a bit of a tin ear for the sort of the rhythmic stuff. I mean, Fables reads beautifully to me, and I love listening to it, particularly in the audio book with Ian McKellen. I don't know if anyone's tried that, because it just rolls. And as you say, the more that you read it, you start to internalize what that rhythm feels like, even if you're not quite, even if someone said to you, could you point out where the stresses and the trochees are in this line? I don't think I could do that, but it sounds pretty damn good. Okay, so
See,
Yes, Rhonda.
Yeah, Steve, I just wondered if these translations become wordier. Is the original a smaller piece, or is it? How does it compare with the translations?
Great question. Rhonda is
And the
asking
number
if
of
over
words.
time that the translations become wordier. Well, there was a recent translation by Emily Wilson, which is a very good translation, actually. But she took the unusual decision to kind of go back to the original, because she argues that a lot of translations effectively accrete the habits of previous ones. And some of their language becomes flowery and not necessarily a great deal expanded, Rhonda, but certainly it comes to be, that's what we think of when we think of Homer. So she has gone back to the original and retranslated kind of directly, almost without reference to the other translations. And in particular, one of the things that Emily Wilson wants to bring out is the fact that we talk about, or some of the translations talk about servants, or even slaves, or concubines. And Emily Wilson wants to point out that these are in fact sexually trafficked women. They have been kidnapped and repeatedly raped, and that, you know, that we don't want to soften what that actually means, because the Greeks didn't soften it. They didn't care. It was just part of the rites. You go in and you conquer a city like Troy, kill all the men because they can only cause trouble, enslave the children, or maybe kill some of the children, kill children of the king, and take the women back with you to work as slaves for you. So Emily Wilson was arguing that you want to kind of read this anew, afresh. But no, I don't think they've particularly got necessarily that much longer. And you know, and some people will just not warm to Fagles. Some people just don't like the sound of it. And if you try another one and you prefer that, there's nobody really to tell you that you're right or wrong. So here's a little bit of a summary of books 2 and 3. Before we get into it, Telemachus calls an assembly. And this is the first example that I want to talk about today. Is there's a lot of doubling going on. In the first book, he effectively called an assembly with the suitors, and now he's doing it again with the local people of the area. And so the question then becomes, why is it happening twice? Why not just once? You can see that if Homer had wanted to, he could have conflated what happens in the two assemblies into one, but he chooses for it to happen twice. And then with the instigation of the goddess Athena, who is embodied in I put Mentor here. I don't mean Mentor, do I? I mean Nestor. It's Mentor who is the goddess Athena, who is nurturing Telemachus and saying, you've got to go and see Nestor, and you've got to go and see Menelaus. So book 2 is about the visit to go and see Nestor. And then in book 3, we hear from Nestor, but still no news of Odysseus. And Nestor sends his son Pisistratus with Telemachus to Sparta to see Menelaus and Helen of Sparta, Troy, Sparta. She's back. I don't know if you can read this, but this is the chronology so far. So the first, and on the left we can see the sequence of the days. So by the end of book 4, which is where we're going to be previewing today, we'll have got through 6 days following the timeline at Odysseus's palace, where he is not. So the first assembly so there's an assembly of the gods. Mentor is sent down to go and visit Telemachus. Telemachus has an assembly in Ithaca, and then he gathers a crew and sets sail for Pylos. He arrives in Pylos. Nestor advises him to see Menelaus in Sparta. Telemachus heads from Pylos to Sparta. He gets to Sparta in books towards the end of book 3 and the beginning of book 4. Menelaus has a wedding scheduled and can't meet Telemachus until the next day. So then the next day, Menelaus tells Telemachus that Odysseus is alive and being held prisoner by Calypso. So this is, I think we've already heard reference to this at the beginning of book 1. So it's not news to us, but it is news to Telemachus. Meanwhile, the suitors realize that Telemachus is beginning to stir, and they decide that they're going to kill him on the way back. And just to, without plot spoiling, as I said in the email, the first 4 books are referred to as the Telemachiad because they're all about Telemachus. Then the book changes pace, and finally we get to meet Odysseus. And Telemachus remains kind of frozen, as it were, with Menelaus, and doesn't return until book 15. So a lot of the ancient commentators, by the way, used to point to this as being one of the ways in which Homer was a sloppy poet or a sloppy narrator, that he didn't know how to tell his story very well, because we've got all of this stuff. And obviously you could cut out all of the Telemachiad, but as we've already discussed, it does give us, it creates a kind of an extraordinary sense of tension in the plot, because the poet's been going on for ages now, and we still haven't met the guy that it's named after. You know, it's like if you had Macbeth not showing up for the first 2 acts, you go, well, come on, when are we going to get to the meat?
Can I ask the suitors plot to murder Telemachus? How do they know what he's up to? Because they're busy drinking wine at home, and he's elsewhere, so they've got a spy.
That's right. Well, and this is one of the interesting things.
Or was it a sneaky god?
No, it is a spy. It's not a spy. It's actually someone who I think takes delight in telling us. So the suitors are sitting around carousing as per usual, and he says, "When am I going to get the ship back from Telemachus then?" And they go, "What? What? Yeah, because Telemachus is," and they go, "You are kidding me." Yeah, so we will get to see that because it's in book 4 that we're going to be previewing today. Okay.
One thing that I find a little bit confusing, the crew of the boat were chosen by Mentor, but Mentor wasn't really Mentor, it was Athena. Okay, do they know that they actually are in the presence of a goddess?
No, I don't think so.
No.
I don't think so.
Okay.
Somebody realises that.
Somebody realizes.
I think they realise when she goes off quickly and changes into an eagle.
Yeah, well, that's one realization. But also, Mentor is spotted back on Ithaca when he's meant to be away with Telemachus. So someone goes, well, hang on, wait a minute. If he's gone, but I saw him yesterday. And going back to your point earlier about the strangeness of the book, and I started talking about your tolerance for ambiguity. One of the things that reading such a book from such a different age, I think one of the things that's enticing about it is that we have to kind of shelve our own values, our ideas about how people work, about what happens in the afterlife, about the supernatural, and instead just kind of go, well, what do these people think? So rather than, if you don't mind me saying so, rather than reaching for drugs as being our explanation for them behaving so crazed, it's alternatively just that they saw the world as working in a very different way than we do. Sorry, Rena.
You said you have to have a willing suspension of disbelief.
Yeah.
And I think that's part of it. You just have to accept the parameters.
Yeah. And see what he does with it. So it's, you know, it's rather than trying to, because you're right, there's lots of loose ends and lots of things, and you go, well, why is he talking about this? Why are we suddenly talking about Agamemnon getting home? You know, and it's always with a reason. So you can kind of trust that there is something going on here. And that's when the rereading comes back, because he is sowing lots of things that don't pay off till a dozen books later, as we shall see. So let's get into it. Let's begin with the beginning of book 2.
So can I just comment on that?
Yeah.
My suspension of disbelief. I found really interesting the roles of the gods in the human lives. I mean, it's so different from our much more secular view that the gods were actively involved in the lives of mortals. The mortals knew they were there. There was this really aware and active interaction going on all the time, which I thought was really interesting.
I think I feel it's heretic license to a certain extent, and that the gods represent something more than divinity. You know, that it's in a way it's a sort of poetic state, where anything you have to regard them symbolically as well. And the people they interact with sometimes know they've been touched by the divine, and sometimes they don't recognize it. And so I think that it's that sense of the divine, whatever you like to picture it as, whether it's Athena or someone else, I feel that's what they mean in the story, a sort of another dimension of consciousness.
And that is not so far away from many people have a sense of the mystical now and a sense of the spiritual. People with a strong religious belief, whatever, you know, whether it's Christianity or another, will sense that there is more to this world than meets the eye, and that certain things have hidden meaning, which to other people they would flatly deny. I'm listening to a podcast at the moment called Uncanny, which is about ghosts, and I don't know if anyone else knows it. It's about ghosts and the supernatural, and he has team skeptic and team believer. So there's a believer, and she seems to believe anything that she ever hears. Oh, that's a ghost. It's obviously a ghost. The cup fell over. It must have been a ghost. And a skeptic who never believes any of this stuff.
Jacob, if you look at the world, it's have either a religion or gods. We've got all these different religions. There's like an iconic center, it's a Buddha or a god, whatever you like to call them. And then, you know, the ancient Egyptians had their gods. And you have to remember, it was an age where the science was just starting. It was flat earth, they didn't realize. They didn't have any explanations of the. We can't put our modern day thinking.
Yeah, that's right. The scientific method was unknown to them.
Stoffel was later, wasn't he?
Yeah,
He was the one who started science.
Through, well, and even he believed, as did so many people at the time, that a woman might be going mad because her uterus has started wandering around her body. It's where we get the term hysteria from the Greek word for a womb. And there was such a taboo against cutting open human remains that they never looked inside a human being to see how they actually worked. So we're a long way from, and this is 400 years before all of that. So let's get into the book. I'm going to use the lines from Fagles. You may be reading another translation, but if we're doing it sequentially, so we should be all right. So we're at the beginning of book 2. Telemachus sets sail. So when young dawn with her rose-red fingers shone once more, we hear that phrase, I think it's in the Odyssey about 17 times, young dawn with her rose-red fingers. We've talked before a little bit about the oral nature of this poem, and that is part of the reason why. In a future session, I'm going to talk about Milman Perry, who was the scholar who kind of transformed the way that we all think about the Odyssey only 100 years ago by kind of making sense of all of this. And again, it was one of the things that ancient commentators used to say, that it was evidence that Homer was an unsophisticated poet because he kept using the same language, because they were thinking of poetry as being written rather than oral, and different things happen when you're doing it orally. So the true son of Odysseus. So it can't quite remember where it comes up, but in here somewhere is the fact. Well, actually, both Nestor and Menelaus refer to the fact that he looks so much like his father. Even and Helen says, "By God, you're the spitting image." So it's important that his relationship with his father is well and truly established, that we know who he is. So he gets up, and he, having been put to bed by his nurse last night, he gets up and he picks up his sword in line 3 and his spear in line 10. Now, as far as I'm aware, this will be the first time that he's ever put these things on, if you like, in anger. He would have done them because he would have trained, as all of the men did, in using these sorts of weapons, but it would be in a kind of game context like the Olympic Games. So he's actually donning a sword and a spear and taking his father's seat in line 14 or whatever. And then we get to something that I must confess I don't understand, because at the bottom of page 93 in my version, we hear from Egyptius, who is an old man who had sons that went to the war, or one son who went to the war. For one dear son had sailed with King Odysseus, but the brutal Cyclops killed him. So his father is grieving for his son, desolate in his grief, in tears for the son he lost. So we are told that his son was killed by the Cyclops. He can't know that his son was killed by the Cyclops because nobody has come home. So there'll be no one to tell that story. So his son is lost, presumed dead. And I suppose that's okay, because if you like, it's a way of the narrator sort of sneakily filling us in on one of the plot points that the brutal Cyclops kills a whole bunch of Odysseus's men. But again, it reminds us of a really human aspect to all of this, which I've talked about a little bit before. Penelope's situation and Telemachus's, is awful. It's terrible if someone goes away, fights in a war, and you get a letter telling you that your son has been killed, or they just disappear in the outback or something. It's so much worse if they disappear and you have no idea what's happened to them. You don't know if they're alive, if they're dead, and if so, how they met their end, because then your mind is thinking of all of the worst possibilities and hoping for the best possibilities. Maybe they're going to turn up again. So Aegyptius, if you like, represents the parents of all of those sons who were taken away to the war and have not come home. Okay. And he's wondering, well, who's called this council? Why have we got an assembly? Some news he's heard of an army on the march. Word he's caught firsthand so he can warn us now, or some other public matter he'll disclose and argue. He's a brave man, I'd say. So Telemachus is by implication a brave man because he's the one who called the assembly. And he says, no, it's not a public matter. I'll disclose and argue. The crisis is my own. Trouble has struck my house. A double blow. I don't think that is, I think that's reminding us that there's a lot of doubling going on. And to anticipate where I'm going with this is, it's something that if you read a lot of the Bible, or if you're a Christian and well versed in the Bible story, you will know that there's a lot of prefiguring in the Old Testament of what happens in the New Testament. So Jesus is the son of David and is born of a virgin, and all of these features about what happens in the Christian story are prefigured in the Old Testament. The same sort of thing is happening here.
But that makes it sound as though the Old Testament writers are prefiguring it, whereas the other way of looking at it is the Christian writers were saying, hey, that's a handy text. Let's apply that to this new guy.
Well, absolutely. And that takes us back to a really good link for where I want to go with this, because the question then becomes, how much of this is the poet doing this consciously and willfully, knowing where this story is going to go, and how much of it is us kind of reading into the story, and how much, which is what I really think is what happens, is the fact that all poets, anyone who's done any creative writing, and many of you here will know this, when you write and you revisit what you've written, there are things there that you had no idea that you'd written. They come out of somewhere well below the conscious mind. And it's almost as if they're kind of cooling from a kind of common consciousness or something. I don't quite know how to express it. Or Athena. Well, yes, the modern explanation would be the subconscious, which would have made no sense at all to the Greeks of this time, because they had no notion of the conscious. They didn't think of themselves quite in the same way as being agents and individuals with responsibilities.
But in there, so do you think, like, the voice in our head said, oh, no, we should do this? Do you think that they thought that was the God speaking?
Well, there is I can't remember the reference, I'll send it to you. There is a very provocative book. I know his surname is Jane, and he's talking about the bicameral function of the brain. And he claims that if I remember it correctly, in the Iliad, there is no sense of self-consciousness. But that by the time of the Odyssey, which is a slightly later poem, that idea is beginning to emerge. So in other words, he is saying that human consciousness, as we understand it, self-awareness, self-consciousness, emerges at just this time. That people are no longer just doing stuff. They are reflecting on what it is they're doing and wondering about their own motivations and wondering about what causes them to do these things. Whether you buy that argument, I don't know. Yes, although before the collapse of the Bronze Age, there was writing in the 16th, 15th, 14th, 13th century BCE. So, and then it died out again, and now it is being recovered. So it doesn't seem as if it's, or maybe they had that sense of self-consciousness, and that went away when writing went away. Who knows? Who knows?
Subconscious may not be spoken of, but would be there through priests and things like that, because you know, the mind games and things like that, you know, with people's understanding the way that these people are interacting and boosting up their egos, and you're like a god, and the elevations of things that, you know, you can't just say, oh, it's got to come from dreams or yearning or something behind everyday life. So it has to be present.
I don't know. I don't know. The priests often tended, whatever the circumstance, they would tend to say, you obviously didn't sacrifice right to the gods.
Yeah.
They're kind of backup excuse.
Control, etc. like that, because they, you know, they've got to be a top dog. But, you know, for them to, like, even in their dreams and stuff, and even through this book, it sort of comes through that they have some levels of different consciousness.
Yeah, and because people ask each other, I had this dream, what do you think it could mean?
Yeah.
They had a sense that it...
But they just didn't start dreaming at this poem.
No.
Yeah,
No.
No. Years, you know, we've been dreaming since hopefully creation.
So we're at line 59, and there is one of many references to the sutras infesting our palace day and night. They are really maggots, these people. They're an infestation, like rodents or something. So if anyone else wants to jump in with anything as we're going through this. So at the end of this assembly, Telemachus runs out of road again, pretty much as he did with the suitors. Filled with anger, down on the ground, he dashed the speaker's scepter, bursting into tears. So he was doing a good impersonation of a grown-up for a while, but he ran out of resources, which is what happens with young people, I guess, and not only young people.
Bursting into tears was an acceptable way of expressing your extreme emotion.
No, I think in this case it is the tears here mean frustration and you know, an inability to, yeah. So then Antinous, who's basically the shop steward of the suitors, the one who reckons he's in pole position to get in with Penelope, speaks up, and he refers to your own dear mother, the matchless queen of cunning. Now here is an interesting bit. Line 100 so this was her latest masterpiece of guile. She set up a great loom in the royal halls and began to weave, and the weaving fine spun, the yarns endless. So the story, which is very famous here, that Penelope is staving off the suitors by creating a death shroud. Thank you.
Yes.
Death shroud for Odysseus's father, Laertes, who's very old and close to death, and he shouldn't die without a death shroud because he's a king and all of the rest of it. And then each night she unweaves it, which leads me to talk about this, which you can't read because that falls over the top there. A note on text, parchment, scrolls, and codices. So we've variously referred to the Odyssey having 24 books, episodes, chapters. The original Greek for it was rhapsodes. So they were regarded as being like elements of a poem, like a rhapsody. It doesn't matter. Those titles are interchangeable because they're just our modern division of the Odyssey. Anyone know why there might be 24 rather than 25 or 17?
What they written on those scrolls, if they're wrong.
Exactly right. The Iliad is the same. There are 24, which corresponds to the number of letters in the Greek alphabet, because this is pre-book technology. So the technology was on parchment, animal skin, which is sort of scraped and cured and whatever it is they need to do, and then written either vertically. I mean, that one on the right looks like a toilet roll or something, or as on the left, that way. So they would sewn together these pieces of parchment and put together into a roll. And you can see there's a kind of practical length beyond which you can't really manage them. You can't store them. You can't drag them down from the shelves. You can't open up and read them. And you don't want to be rolling hundreds and hundreds of meters of parchment to get to somewhere. So that is why it is believed the Odyssey is divided like that, because it's about, practically speaking, about the maximum length that a scroll could exist as. What succeeded the scrolls really came with the invention of papyrus, or the development of papyrus in Egypt and around the Nile. Or rather, before that, here on the left, you've got clay tablets, which were very, very common throughout this period, but not before this period, because there were no clay tablets. I'll answer the obvious question in just a second, how we know. But the clay tablets were very, very common and were a disposable form of writing. You could use it for taking notes, and then you would just smooth it over. You'd take a stone or something and smooth over the clay and write again. So obviously this lends itself to sort of stylus type writing. This, by the way, is where we get the word and the concept of the palimpsest, because a palimpsest means something which is, you're looking back through the layers. When these clay tablets were discovered by archaeologists and X-rays came along, not only could you read what was written on the top layer of the clay, but by using different kind of strengths of X-ray, you could read what had been rubbed out and what was written before. So you could sometimes read 4 or 5 different layers. So how do we know that clay was not being used at this time? In other words, there was no writing. Well, there are no clay tablets left. But clay by its nature is very disposable. The only way it survived is when you have earthquakes or fires, or as at Pompeii, you have a volcano which covers everything in ash. There's a huge hoard at Herculaneum, which were burnt, but sorry, I'm talking about scrolls now, but clay tablets, there are plenty of clay tablets of Linear A and Linear B, which was the Mycenaean pre-Troy technology, writing based on the Phoenicians. And it was only solved by Michael Ventris after the Second World War, when he realized that it was actually an early form of Greek lettering. So it had to be decoded, and it's like war codes. You see the repeated symbols, and you have to try and work out the most likely one is likely to be in English it would be the letter E. So you just kind of start from there, and you hope to find a name that you can connect. But there are no clay tablets from this period before the Odyssey and the Iliad, which indicates that there was no writing at all. And then you get the codex, or the invention of what we regard as the book. Okay. This is where I'm feeling a little bit pleased with myself, because the word text has an interesting origin. It originally comes from the Proto-Indo-Europe, right down at the bottom there, Proto-Indo-European root text, to weave, to fabricate, to make wicker or wattle framework. So our word text and the word texture have the same root and the same idea, that you are weaving something together. Well, when you write a text, when you write something, that it has a connection with weaving. And I've got a sense, and again, I'm not going to say whether Homer is doing this deliberately or subconsciously, or whether this is just me or us reading it back into what Penelope is doing, that what she is doing has an analogy with what Homer is doing. because an oral story is something that you stand up and you tell, quite possibly at a festival. So you might be invited to be the headline speaker at a great 3-day festival. You might speak for 4 hours a day for the whole 3 days. But at the end of it, there's nothing left. You start again. It's all gone. It's disappeared through your fingers. Of course, there was no way of recording any of this time at this time, you know. Not only you couldn't record the voice, but there was no writing, so it was all in the poet's head. So I think that's what Penelope is doing here, that it's a kind of an analogy with storytelling, would be my estimate, my guess. Okay, so we know that her gifts came from Athena, because Athena is the goddess of skill. So she did for 3 years. Now this is again is a crucial but very, very subtle thing. If you look on that version, it's page 96. 3 whole years she deceived us blind, seduced us with this scheme. Then when the wheeling seasons brought the 4th year on, one of her women in on the queen's secret told the truth, and we caught her in the act. So the suitors suddenly rumbled as to why it was taking her such a time to build a typical men. They wouldn't know how long this kind of thing would take, and it wouldn't occur to them to challenge it. But that tells us something really crucial, which is going to become incredibly important later in the story. What does that detail tell us?
About Penelope.
About the situation at the palace.
It's very tenuous.
It's tenuous. One of the queen's women told the suitors, betrayed.
Feelings on the knife.
Yeah, so in fact, it's almost like that shroud being pulled apart. You know, that unity is very, very threadbare and hanging on a knife edge. I'm not mixing my metaphors too much there, but very fragile. And similarly, again, when we're looking at the doubling, soon we're going to see that the suitors are beginning to fray as well. They start showing signs of disunity. So again, this all adds to the sense of foreboding, the sense of crisis. And, you know, the more that the crisis calls, the more we're longing to hear from you know who. Okay. Moving on. Funnily enough, we get the old warrior Halitherses down at about line 195 or so. He's saying, well, I told you all this. He said, just as I said it would that day, the Argives sailed for Troy and the mastermind of battle boarded with them. I said then, after many blows and all his shipmates lost, after 20 years had whirled by, he would come home. Yeah, I'm sure you did. I'm sure you did, you know. So, well, I told you all this at the time. Yeah, right. But there is, so again, this is the narrator finding a way of telling us where this is headed, while at the same time you don't feel as if the secret's been given away. It's pretty obvious that Odysseus is not just going to disappear and is going to be buried in an unmarked grave. Otherwise, you know, the poem wouldn't take us anywhere. All right. Line 240 odd, Telemachus says, now, if I hear my father's alive and heading home, hard pressed as I am, I'll brave out 1 more year. If I hear he's dead, no longer among the living, then I'll come back to the native land I love, raise his grave mound, build his honours high, with the full funeral rites that he deserves, and give my mother to another husband. So it's reminding us that the stakes are very, very high. And this is the opportunity, the gap for Odysseus to come in and give us a different solution just by his return. Okay. So, and then down line 290 onwards, Telemachus walking the beach now, far from others. Well, we're just about to meet Odysseus at the beginning of book 5. And guess where we find him? At the beach. He's actually on the headland, pining, looking out to sea. And I was thinking about this morning, actually, that for Telemachus, you know, he's about to set sail, and there's no, I mean, I'm not saying he's never been off Ithaca at all, but he's never really been anywhere significant. And, you know, the beach, the landing, the leaving point, it's like a kind of liminal space. It's the real beginning of the journey, something that he's never done before. And equally, Odysseus is trapped. We've already heard this, so we know where he is. He's trapped with the goddess Calypso. Terrible fate for a man, awful. 7 years, every night this beautiful, extraordinary goddess forces him to have sex with her every night. And then every day he goes and sits at the headland and cries and wishes he was home. But then he comes back again at night
I
time.
think somewhere there's one or two children from that.
Yeah, there's kind of like sort of ripples out from myth that lots of different stories get told in different ways. We get told that Helen of Sparta never went to Troy, that really she was spirited off to Egypt and a double was sent in her place, kind of to get her off the hook. So you can't make all of the stories fit together because they're telling a much wider story. Okay. Line 310, few sons are the equal of their fathers, most fall short, all too few surpass them. But you, brave and adept from this day on, Odysseus' cunning has hardly given out in you. There's every hope that you will reach your goal. So again, the poet has the challenge of showing Telemachus as being young, callow, inexperienced, inept, but with the potential to be able to grow, which is what he needs to do, and rapidly, so that when his father gets home, they can be allies and almost equals together. And there's a very, very interesting point at which, when Odysseus does get home, spoiler alert, Telemachus almost steals Odysseus's thunder. And Odysseus has to kind of step in and say, I'll take it from here, son. Thanks, Dad. I was doing so well as well. Okay. So Eurycleia, the old favoured nurse who brought up Odysseus and has now been bringing up Telemachus, she's going to become very important in the story later on. So whenever you see her mentioned, so she has not told Penelope that Telemachus has gone away. Penelope she can't see what there is in it for Telemachus to go away. He's risking his life. She wants him to just stay at home, which I think, there's part of every parent, in particular, part of every mother who kind of, that for your children to thrive, they have to leave. But at the same time, you're afraid of the risks and the consequences of doing so. Okay, so that kind of takes us to the end of book 2, apart from something I'm just going to preface because we're not going to be touching on this just now. In line 469, Fagles talks about a dark blue wave. And the same thing comes up again in about line 7 of book 3. Sea blue main.
It's a lovely expression.
It is, but I think he is cheating for reasons that we will see in a future session. I want to talk about colours in Homer. And as a little bit of a clue, there was no Greek word for blue. There's a stunning thought.
It's the Wine-Dark Sea.
The Wine-Dark Sea. Epi oina paponton. Indeed. Okay, so book 3.
Where was that Wine-Dark Sea?
The Wine-Dark Sea actually comes up on the first page of Ulysses, doesn't it, Rena? There are several references to the Wine-Dark Sea, but not quite here. We've got a dark blue wave at 469, and on 7, the god of the sea blue main who shakes the earth. That is Poseidon. Okay, so book 3, line 106 or 107 or so, we've got a reference to that man was born for pain. Odysseus, and this is a pun on Odysseus's name, which seems etymologically to mean, Odysseus seems to mean man of pain. And it's not quite clear whether he is suffering or inflicting, or probably both. But he's troubled to be around. Trouble seems to follow him everywhere. He causes and suffers pain. And the best that I think one of the translators has done with this is to come up with the word odious as being like a kind of almost like a homonym of Odysseus. It sounds like that sort of sense of someone who is troubled. So Nestor, line 130 onwards, says, your father, yes, if in fact you are his son. I look at you and a sense of wonder takes me. Your way with words, it's just like his. I'd swear no youngster could ever speak like you, so apt, so telling. As long as I and the great Odysseus soldiered there, never once did we speak out at odds. So he is being recognized by these old veterans, these colleagues of his father, as being the spitting image of Odysseus, which is quite a compliment. So again, the question, why does Telemachus go off and meet two of his father's veteran mates, Nestor and then Telemachus? From the point of view of the narrative, he could pass all of the news through one of those two guys. Well, I think it's partly to do with the doubling that I was talking about before. There seems to be a thing of kind of things happening in twos, which is kind of Telemachus and Odysseus. But there is another reason as well. Yeah. But why does the poet choose for Nestor to do that?
But this is an oral thing. If there's a big point to be made, what does that want sort of when you're through it?
An Englishman, an Irishman, and a Scotsman walk into a pub. Yeah. Now you know where you're going. So if we've got Nestor, we've got Menelaus, and in fact they tell us that all the other heroes have got home apart from Odysseus, which is the very news that Athena seems to have sent Telemachus to go and find out. And he finds out very little. So it's not as if he is there on a news finding, a fact finding expedition. It's much more to do with when he meets Nestor and his family, his sons. He's seeing what a well-ordered society should look like. He's come from one where there is chaos and anarchy and no kind of real male role models. And Nestor,
being groomed as well, isn't he?
He is being groomed, exactly.
Through learning.
Yeah. But he does extraordinarily well with what he knows. He knows the rules of Xenia. So he knows how to behave, which is one of the things that impresses Nestor. And if you remember, you'll see the same pattern happening again, that you take the guy in, you take his weapons from him, so he's no longer a danger. But crucially, you don't ask him who he is or what his story is, because your hospitality is unconditional. We'll feed you, we'll water you, maybe even give you somewhere to sleep. And then when we've done all that and we put aside our appetites and everything, then you can tell us who you are and what you're about. So those are kind of crucial elements of the story. And around about 220, this is one of those things that will, if you were doing this blind, certainly I remember the first time I read it, I kept wondering, why are we getting this stuff? Atreus' son Agamemnon. It's like, why are we talking about Agamemnon now? You yourselves, even in far-off Ithaca, must have heard how he returned, how Aegisthus hatched the king's horrendous death. But what a price he paid. So Aegisthus paid a price in blood, in suffering. Ah, how fine it is when a man is brought down to leave a son behind. So why are we suddenly talking about Agamemnon being murdered? What's that got to do with the Odyssey? Apart from the fact that Agamemnon was one of the other soldiers.
Well, his partner took up with, I guess, couldn't she?
That's right, yeah.
In Agamemnon's action, and then they colluded to kill him.
Yeah. So if you like this,
he might be in line.
Exactly right. Exactly right, Rena. What you're saying. Odysseus does not know. He cannot be confident of a warm welcome. Because look what happened to Agamemnon. Admittedly, Clytemnestra killed him because he murdered he slit their daughter's throat to get the ships to be able to sail.
Actually isn't mentioned in these.
No.
No, the emphasis is complete. There's no kind of revealing point of view from her position. I thought when it was coming out, it was to show Penelope is really a good woman and hasn't behaved like them.
Yeah.
And there's a few references in here to.
That's right. Yeah. But if you like, it's to show the possibility that, she is. We know that she's faithful, and they test each other out, to make sure that the ground is safe. But there is still that testing required. Yeah.
It's warned not to stay away for too long anyway. So
Yeah. Yes. He is. You're right. I can't remember where that is.
Yeah, it's just after that because they talk about the suitors.
And then, because we do want to get to preview book 4, and I've got another couple of things I want to show you as well. You get a real rich sense of irony round about lines 240 onwards when Telemachus is saying, Nestor says, if only the bright-eyed goddess chose to love you just as she lavished care on brave Odysseus. And Telemachus says, never, your majesty, that will never come to pass. And she's standing there right beside him. And Telemachus, Pallas Athena broke in sharply, her eyes afire. What's this nonsense slipping through your teeth? Which is Zeus's favourite line. What are you talking? What nonsense slips through your teeth? It's light work for a willing god to save a mortal even half the world away. And it's like she's almost frustrated with him because she's well, I'm here. Hello. And then we won't go into this in detail. Then there's another amusing irony because Athena and Poseidon, if you remember, are on separate sides. They're enemies. Until Nestor says, "Let's drink a toast to Poseidon." Then, so Mentor is going, and Pallas Athena's going, "Oh God, yeah, oh yeah, good luck, Poseidon." All right. So I urge you to visit Menelaus. I'm going to take us on to another thing that I wanted to talk about here. Oh, going the wrong way. Okay, well, that's just a revision of the... Yeah, I want to show you what it was that Telemachus is discovering. One of the ways in which the poet distinguishes between Nestor and Menelaus's palace is that Menelaus's palace is like heaven on earth. It's the most luxurious thing. Telemachus' eyes almost fall out of his head. Nestor's palace was quite something because by comparison, Ithaca is really nothing very much at all. It's really kind of quite modest. It's a rocky, as we already heard, it's not good for agriculture. They've got goats and pigs and that's about it, and hills. This overlaps with real archaeological evidence. This happens to be the palace at Mycenae, which is a particular place, but which has been given the name for the whole culture across all of this of Greece at this time. So now I'm going to have fun trying to get YouTube to show. So it's just like a kind of a minute long video that shows us what has actually been uncovered. So this is a 3D model. So I want you to kind of imagine the sense of astonishment that Telemachus is part of his education. He's seeing what real wealth looks like, how the other half lives. This is all real. These are the uncovered remains. I mean, obviously they're not all complete, but this is archaeologically accurate. It's a citadel with about 100 outbuildings, and then a palace, as we'll see in just a second. It's not very smooth, but it was coming up. The Wi-Fi here must be a bit poor.
Where is this?
This is Mycenae, which is so it's just on the mainland, down the bottom left-hand corner of Greece, so not that far from Ithaca. And so this is the Peloponnese, and Mycenae, Sandy Pylos, which is where Nestor comes from, and Sparta, which is where Menelaus' palace is, are all quite close together. Now, this bit is important. I'm going to come back over this. This is the Megaron, which is the standard formation for a Mycenaean palace. I'll show you in a second what I mean, but it's 3 rooms. There's an outer courtyard, something in the middle called a vestibule, and then you come into the grand room. The throne, you see, is always on the right. There's a hearth in the middle and 4 pillars, and these are very, very richly decorated. So you would be, as with any king or lord's palace, half the intention of it is to intimidate you with just the scale of the luxury and the fabulous wealth. If this is what you can afford to live in, imagine the power is like.
I guess that, I mean, all the villagers would be living around there. would they?
Yeah, that's right. And because of course you were their slave, but also you enjoyed their protection.
Yeah.
So if you
It's like a walled city.
Yeah. Yeah. So this is a now we get into some kind of slightly contentious area here, because this is a reconstruction of what some people believe, I myself happen to believe, is the palace at Ithaca that is that the poet has in mind when he talks about Odysseus's palace. Much more modest by comparison. And archaeologists, by the way, will poo-poo this kind of talk about trying to reconstruct historical reality from a poem. They don't like that kind of stuff. Me, I love it. I've been there. I've been to Ithaca. I have walked down the steps that Penelope walks down. You know. So.
It obviously was a moving experience.
Oh, it was. No, it was. I got our tour guide to sign my copy of the book. He must have thought I was a bit bonkers.
Was the theatre there as well?
I don't know if she was invisible on that day. So although you can't see it very clearly, you see where 7 and 11 are. You have again that megaron, the 3-roomed structure. So in fact, it's kind of a definition of a Mycenaean. And it wasn't only used in the palaces. The sort of better off people would have a version. It was almost like our kind of Victorian early 20th century model of the hall, and then you have a front parlour and then a back room, you know. So you open a front door of a house that's 100 years old and you kind of know what it's going to look like unless they've knocked it down and rearranged it. It's kind of built on a bit of a template. So this is the megaron. And it helps to understand so much of the geography of where Telemachus has come from, and the palace at Sandy Pylos, or where Nestor is, and the palace at Sparta where Menelaus is. So you come in from outside. This is uncovered, so it's an outdoor courtyard. Then there is this thing which is called a vestibule. Nobody really knows what its practical functions will have been, but its kind of primary function really seems to have been a sort of an entrance to the king's place, because you know a lot of business would be conducted here. But if you were really important, we're going to take you in. We are really, oh my God! And then your socks would be blown off because you would be thrilled with the luxury that you saw there. So as always, the throne is on the right. You have these 4 pillars, and you have a hearth in the middle. Now, quite interestingly, it seemed that quite often you would bed down here. That Odysseus is put down to sleep. He's offered, I think, a room, and he says, "No, I'll just bed down here. Just give me some furs to lie on, and I will lie here." But this, of course, is kind of the heart of the poem. This is the idea of home that Odysseus is trying to get back to. And this is where all of the action, when he does get back, this is where it's all going to take place. Penelope lives in rooms upstairs. So she comes down the stairs. She's always walking up and down. If you remember the first time that we heard Telemachus talking to her, and he's very insensitive and says that stupid thing, and she bursts into tears and she goes upstairs to cry herself to sleep. And there's a kind of detail about their private bedroom, Penelope and Odysseus's bedroom, that eventually we will find, which is, I won't reveal it because it's kind of a secret between the two of them, that that only the other person would know about if the other person has been faithful. So that's kind of a crucial details.
So what's that called again? Those 3 rooms?
The megaron.
Megaron.
So just
Is there only one exit?
yeah. So and therefore part of it obviously is that this is where the king is safest, because you know, if you got to there, if you got through the citadel, that's the last place to defend. I mean, the king's power was virtually gone if he's having to defend that. But it's not a bad place to corner some blokes in, should the need arise, you know, should they need to be dealt with.
So that reminds me of, you know, when I've seen all those BBC series of Elizabethan court, or, you know, where they, well, a lot of business is done outside, and then you're taken into the,
Yeah,
Henry VIII always refers to it, you know, through.
yeah,
through those rooms.
there's a, yes, I mean, in fact, that makes me wonder, because
Yeah.
if you go to Hampton Court, there's a whole world downstairs. You know, remember that old series, Upstairs, Downstairs? The downstairs people would never see the upstairs people. You actually had a group of people whose job it was to take the food that had been cooked downstairs, and they would be the ones who brought it upstairs. So the kings would never see the poor buggers who actually worked downstairs, and vice versa. I don't quite know what the arrangement was here with the bringing in of food. Presumably you had servants or slaves who would walk in with it, carry in the food. But at the moment, you have this sense that there's 108 suitors at Ithaca, and they're kind of plagued, they're infesting, it's like an infestation of rats or mice. You know, they're lolling around here, drinking, because there's storerooms and stuff around here where the wine is being stored, and
They're actually in the centre of.
yeah, absolutely. So
I imagine they're outside.
no, they're crawling all over the place, and there's nobody able to kind of defend.
If I start with that, just what it is, the poem refers to low and high back chairs quite often when there's a gathering. Does that mean there are two kinds of chairs, or does it mean they're low chairs with high backs?
No, I don't know, and that is a good question.
And I suppose they bring them in when they're going to eat.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know.
Okay, thanks. All right.
No,
These spaces must be pretty big if you've got 108 people.
Yeah. Yeah. The grand ones are really grand. Actually, did I have any more illustration of this? Yeah, this is a somewhat fantastical reconstruction by someone. On Crete, Sir Arthur Evans was the archaeologist who kind of uncovered the Cretan civilization, which is earlier than the Mycenaean civilization. But if you go there, that looks like this, and it's all kind of speculative. You know, we found fragments of paint on some walls, so you know that it was heavily, and we would think kind of garishly decorated. Just as, you know, our idea of Roman statuary is always of white marble. Well, of course, nobody ever saw a white statue in the Roman times. It was always gaudy, you know, very, very bright, standout colours.
Just a quick point, there's obviously no windows in this place.
No, this, because it's an open hearth, there is like kind of an open, it's covered, but it goes, the smoke is allowed to escape up there.
But I just think it would be quite dark, isn't it?
Yeah, that actually is what olive oil was used for at the time. But at this period, they did not eat olives or drink the oil. It was used as fuel. And also, oddly, I still don't quite understand this. Every time someone has a bath, they get smeared in olive oil afterwards, which doesn't. I don't get a good feel about that. You know, you get it, and if you're cooking in the kitchen, you get olive oil on your hands, and you're trying to cook. The first thing you want to do is to wash it off so you can. Well, I don't know.
Moisturizer.
No, that must have been its function. And they would have been bathed. So I think is it in this palace or in? I think Menelaus's palace. Menelaus's own daughter bathes Telemachus, and they didn't seem to have any issues with modesty. So Eurycleia bathes Telemachus.
Yes, and he comes out looking like a god.
All glistening and
Weightlifters and so on well themselves, you know, so I think it's partly an aesthetic thing.
Olive oil was used as a beauty product in many things. It was like the olive tree was a gift from the gods to the people because it was a fuel, then it became edible as well.
And today, even I know women that use olive oil.
Olive oil.
Just-
There you go, Steve, you can start using.
Yeah. It's true, but they didn't have oils and stuff.
But it's-
Actually antiseptic, etc. stuff.
Yeah.
Then massage, you know, it's part of that washing process, maybe rubbing the oil and just massaging and relaxing.
And it is an important fact that these the olive trees grow a very, very long time. That will become a plot point later on. So when Telemachus gets to go and see the king and queen of Sparta, so Menelaus and Helen, there is a wedding taking place. And again, this is one of the ways in which the poet distinguishes between Nestor, who is the old warrior and a real windbag. He goes on, in the stories in the Iliad just go on forever, and people start wandering off halfway through, going, well, I'm sorry, but I really do have to be going. And he comes, yes, and he comes up in Ulysses, as in James Joyce's Ulysses, as the old windbag, Mr. Deasy. So you think about Menelaus and Helen. You know, Nestor is a family man. He's won life's lottery in the sense of being an old soldier who gets home safe, and his family are doing well, and he's got a lot of wealth. And in fact, at some point, there's a reference to kind of saying that to the sort of sense of regret that all of this war at Troy was not worth everything that it cost us. You know, which is there's a kind of a note of old soldiers' regret, you know, the trauma that they have experienced and inflicted, the colleagues that they've seen, you know, hacked to pieces, the hacking to pieces that they've done themselves, and this kind of sense, you know, kind of an old world weariness that Telemachus obviously doesn't have as a young man. So that's Nestor. Menelaus and Helen have this really interesting dynamic. When you read book 4, try and think about the relationship between the two of them, because she ran off with another bloke 20 years ago, and that's what caused the whole of the Trojan War. All of these men died, and these women were raped, and these children were enslaved because of her. And yet they've come home. Menelaus brings Helen home from Troy after Troy has been just razed to the ground. And they've kind of resumed their relationship. But their relationship is a really interesting one, because she seems in so many ways smarter, more knowing than he is. And so Menelaus is just about to say to young Telemachus, and he holds himself back and he says, by God, you're the spitting image. But Helen comes straight in and says, I don't believe it. Surely this is Odysseus reincarnated. So they have this really interesting relationship. And talking about drugs, I don't know if that's what prompted you to talk about drugs.
He's analytical. Piece a lot of this together because it's still so untidy.
But
It's
she
the
uses
beginning.
drugs. She uses drugs.
But it's also the way that their gods pop in and out. So
Yeah.
you
Yeah,
can
but it's
say
the drugs I just want to mention, because
that- yeah, she
we're,
does.
she does. She think
pacify them.
so. They've had all of this discussion, and then she comes in and gives them this thing called, I think it's called nepenthe, which is meant to kind of mask grief, so that it says, she slipped a drug, heart seeds, dissolving anger, magic to make us all forget our pains. No one who drank it deeply, mulled in wine, could let a tear roll down his cheeks that day, not even if his mother should die, his father die, not even if right before his eyes some enemy brought down a brother or darling son with a sharp bronze blade. So this is a narcotic, you know, kind of like an opium or something.
But I mean, all throughout Europe and other places, you know, herbalists use different things for curing, healing, you know, particularly in those days, you know, if you didn't like someone, you get an hemlock and stuff like that.
Yeah, but
So I think they were widely used. So I'm just trying to piece it together in my untidy mind. And saying, okay, they can have hallucinations or be off their head that day, you know, just gave me an explanation
Well, but it also, it's kind of a gateway to, because there's a couple of things that Helen does. Administering this drug, she obviously knows stuff. And if this doesn't make you think like, you know, the witches in Macbeth or women in the Middle Ages who were labeled as witches or, you know, possessed if they knew they had secret women's business kind of thing. But also there is this is where we hear about this is where the Trojan horse comes in book 4.
Yeah.
You hear that story, but on a couple of occasions Helen and Odysseus have already interacted, and this is one of those prefiguring doubling type things that I want you to think about, which will make an awful lot more sense by the time we've got to the end of the poem. What a feat that, so this is Helen talking, what a feat that hero dared and carried off in the land of Troy where Euachaeans suffered. Scarring his own body with mortifying strokes, throwing filthy rags on his back like any slave, he slipped into the enemy's city, roamed its streets all disguised, a totally different man, a beggar, hardly the figure he cut among Achaea's ships. That's how Odysseus infiltrated Troy, and no one knew him at all. Well, now there's a ploy. If you want to penetrate,
we're jumping in book 4 and 5 and stuff. But there's a big important thing I didn't understand in book 3. It's really and that was when they argued about what's the best way of helping Troy, and someone wanted to stay there. I couldn't understand what that was about.
Well, there was a whole cycle, and as the only one that survives is the story of Odysseus. They were called nostoi, so they were long stories, probably as long as the Odyssey, about the journeys home of the different heroes from Troy and the varieties of adventures. And I think what Homer is doing with it is to show the different possibilities that are still available. So Agamemnon gets home and gets murdered in his bath, according to one version by Clytemnestra, or killed by her boyfriend Aegisthus in another version. Nestor gets home and everything is restored to him. Menelaus gets home but has this now fractured relationship with his once unfaithful wife. And to go back to a theme of today, why do they have these different fates? Well, it can only be that the gods intervened. And what causes the gods to intervene? Because of what you yourself have not done correctly. So Menelaus works out that he must not have sacrificed properly, and that's why he's meeting adverse conditions. So he's sent on a whole side trip to go all the way back to Egypt and travel around another way. But that does also, Elliot, that does take us into a really interesting subject, which is outside of the scope certainly of today, but we may get back to it, which is this is a very naval poem.
Yes.
And anyone who knows about sailing, anyone who knows anything about sailing knows more about sailing than I do. But there's an awful lot of ships and of sailing and of trading routes. And there is some speculation that what the travels of Odysseus are reflecting is the Mycenaean civilization that we're talking about here had great trading connections with the whole of the Mediterranean, even down as far as Cornwall in England for the tin. And Afghanistan, for the silver, and Afghanistan for silver, and copper from Cyprus. So they were importing and exporting an awful lot. And that, if you remember, when there was the collapse of the late Bronze Age, that is one of the theories, that something about the instability of their economies caused all of that infrastructure to collapse. And it had a sort of a domino effect that they didn't have their trading partners because they'd been destroyed, which caused your civilization to be destroyed, and therefore everyone downstream of you. So there is some speculation that Odysseus's travels, and maybe to do with the others as well, their stories, reflects some of these trade movements around the Mediterranean.
I think what I found interesting about none of what he learned was about how Odysseus got up, but tried to get up. It's all these other people who say, where does he fit in? I couldn't.
Yeah, exactly. And we do eventually learn a fragment because of this encounter. The other thing, sorry, just to round out that point that I wanted to make about Helen, is that if you like, she's the beginning of You know, when we think about the Odyssey, we think about two things. We think about Odysseus trying to get home and his adventures with the monsters, with the Cyclops, with the Scylla and Charybdis, with the Laestrygonians. And these seem like two very different worlds. One seems like a kind of almost like a fairy tale, or, you know, weird, strange stories of the supernatural or whatever. And if you like, Helen provides some kind of overlap between the two because she knows about using drugs to affect people's kind of psyche. She knows when Odysseus has the bright idea of getting the wooden horse into Troy, Helen, as you will read in book 4, goes around the wooden horse, imitating the voices of the wives of the men inside the horse. So she knows what is going on. And she does this uncanny impersonation of the wives. And it's only Odysseus who's smart enough to realize that this is someone trying to trap them. So again, there's a weird witch-like quality to Helen that I think is worth reflecting on. We are at the end of our time, and I hope you look forward to reading book 4 either again or for the first time. And as I said, if you feel like carrying on, don't hold back. It won't do any harm to come back and read it again. And as I say, each time you read further on, it throws light on what's already happened. All right. Thank you very much, everyone.